Hello, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you're here with us today. This is our March financial check-in with Fame. It is one in a series of webinars that we host on the first Friday of every month. And we'd love to have you visit famemain.com/employers to learn more about this series and to join our mailing list. That would be super. So I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the manager of college access and outreach at the Finance Authority of Maine, and I will be your presenter today. But with me is Mary Dyer, and Mary is our financial education and programs manager. And so she's going to be monitoring the chat today. She'll jump in if there's anything that she needs me to clarify or a question that she thinks just absolutely needs to be addressed in the moment. So please feel free to put any questions that you do have in the chat. We are going to hold questions in general till the very end. I have a ton of content today. It will be recorded, but we want to make sure that we get through that content. So Mary will address your questions in the chat. We'll take them at the end. So one way or another, we'll get them answered. Worst case scenario, we'll answer them in the follow-up email. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So many of you may already be familiar with the Finance Authority of Maine, but we are a quasi-state agency that works to provide financial solutions to help Maine people achieve their business and higher educational goals. The bottom line is what happens is the state legislature and the governor's office sometimes will come up with programs and they need someone to administer them. So a lot of what we do is administer programs that have been created by the state in one way or another. And I'll mention a few of those as we go through today. So the agenda for today is to talk about making college more affordable. And how we're going to do that is we're going to talk a little bit about the piecemeal approach. We're going to talk about how merit scholarships and financial aid works. And then we're going to talk about 5 steps to really help students, families, professionals working with them get prepared and develop a plan. And then we'll end with a few closing thoughts and resources and information on upcoming webinars. So this piecemeal approach, first of all, Mary and I are both not only people who have spent our whole professional lives working in financial aid. We actually met more than 20 years ago in the financial aid office at the University of Maine, but we also are parents and we have college-age kids. My oldest is now 27 and Mary's youngest is in high school. So and then we have 2 in between. So, we have been through this process. So what we share with you today is based on our experience, is based on the work we do, but also our personal experiences as having gone through this process and trying to, navigate paying for college ourselves with our own kiddos. And one of the things that we have found so helpful and really has worked for both of us is this concept of a piecemeal approach. And when people are able to take advantage of this piecemeal approach, we feel like it makes this whole thing seem more possible. There's a lot of stuff that can't be controlled when we're talking about paying for college. Certainly a lot of the costs are out of our control, but by having a piecemeal approach and having many, many pieces available to families to help them pay for higher education means that the more pieces you have, the more options you have, and the less reliance on any one particular type of aid or source of funding. So actually, there are a lot of potential pieces that are available to help pay for higher education. So the first and foremost is financial aid, those need-based grants and scholarships. We talk about merit scholarships, private outside scholarships, savings, parent earnings, student earnings, payment plans, tax credits. Sometimes those don't always come to the forefront when we're thinking about this. And then, of course, loans. They can be the federal direct loans or private student or parent loans. So lots and lots of sources. And we're not going to touch on all of these today, but there are a couple that we'd really like to highlight because we think thinking about them as early as possible is really important. What we see happen a lot is that people are very familiar with the fact that there is financial aid, excuse me, and there are merit scholarships that are potentially available. And a lot of focus and a lot of reliance gets put on these 2 sources of aid. Now, that's a good thing. We want to be sure that people are aware of both of these broad categories of aid. So I don't want to dismiss those in any way. It's just that we don't want the focus to only be on these sources of aid. So let's talk a little bit about these and how they work. So merit scholarships are funds that are typically offered by the admissions office, the athletic department, or the academic department. Merit scholarships are based on who the student is and what the student brings to the table. So for example, students who are very strong academically might find that the admissions office, in with the admissions offer, will say, hey, we want to give you this particular scholarship. If you do well, we're going to keep giving it to you every single year. There are some athletic scholarships, not quite as many as people think sometimes, but sometimes there is money from the athletic department, or an individual college might have money. Having worked at UMaine, the engineering department did have some really good resources of their own. So those resources are focused specifically on the student and the student's achievements or characteristics. Then there's financial aid. And when we think about financial aid, we're thinking about the financial aid that's offered by the financial aid office specifically. And the vast majority of this aid is what we refer to as need-based. And what we mean by that is it's based on the family's financial situation. So it's not based on the student's academic performance in high school, for example. Instead, the focus is on how much financial aid does that family need. How schools figure that out is they have students fill out a financial aid application. So every student should be filling out the FAFSA. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. Every school uses it to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. In Maine, it's the form that's used to determine eligibility for the Maine state grant. And most schools also use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for their own funding. However, there are some schools, they tend to be the schools that have a lot of resources, may require an additional form called the CSS profile. What these forms have in common, and we're really going to focus more on the FAFSA today, but what these forms have in common is the end result of filling out that application is that there's a formula behind it, and that formula results in an EFC, or an expected family contribution. So a theoretical amount that a family can contribute to paying the cost of education. Financial aid offices use that EFC to determine how much need a student has, because again, they're going to award need-based aid. So one of the very first steps used by all schools is to figure out how much need an individual student has. And how they do that, and all schools do this the same way to start. The formula is a very basic formula to start, is they take the cost of attendance at a particular school. And let me just say that that cost of attendance is more than just tuition and fees. So schools do recognize that it is more than just paying the tuition bill, that there's also books, supplies, there's room and board, whether the student lives on campus or off campus. There are travel expenses, and there are other miscellaneous expenses. So when you see the official cost of attendance, keep in mind that it brings all of those pieces into play. And it does reflect the total cost of attending that particular school for a year. And then they subtract out that EFC. And what that gives you is the amount of financial need at that school. Now, because the cost of attendance varies by school, the amount of financial need is going to vary by school. So some schools might have a cost of attendance of maybe $10,000 or $12,000, and others have a cost of attendance over $70,000. So an individual student will have a lot of financial need maybe at some schools and not that much financial need at another school. All schools have the goal of filling 100% of a student's need. There's no one that works in financial aid that doesn't wish that they could fill 100% of every student's need. And if they did, it means that the focus on making decisions with cost in mind probably wouldn't be as big of an issue. If every school could give every student all of their need, then the focus could be solely on some of the other things like major and location and all of that. But here's the reality, unfortunately, is that most schools do not meet full need. So they all try to, but not all of them are able to do so. So what does this mean for families? It means that even the lowest income students often have a gap. So let's just say we have a student that has a 0 EFC. So you have their cost of attendance minus a zero EFC, they have full need to attend that school. Unfortunately, even for those students, many schools are not able to fill that need. So those students have a gap. Middle income families not only have to deal with this having a gap issue, but they often find that the EFCs are higher than anticipated. One of the things that Mary and I were lucky enough, having worked in financial aid, is we were prepared for this. We knew what our EFCs were going to look like, so we could plan accordingly. But what happens many times is people don't start looking at this process until senior year, and they're really caught off guard by what that EFC is because it's higher than they anticipated that it was going to be. So with that said, what can you do? You, the parent, or those of you who are working with students and parents, what is the information that we want communicated? We want to be sure that people do continue to apply for need-based aid and do everything they can to get merit scholarships. But the reality is those often are not enough to make it financially feasible to attend many schools. So what we've done here at FAME is we've started thinking about, okay, how do we pull it all together? How do we make college more affordable? Meaning, how do we make it more affordable with the things that families themselves have more control over? We'd love to get costs down, but what are some of the things that you actually can do to make it more affordable? And Mary's going to share a piece that we put together, a handout that we have that really focuses on a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about in the remaining session. So there are 5 steps that we believe can really help families get prepared and develop a plan that will allow them to make college more affordable, and to make college more affordable by maximizing this piecemeal approach. So we're going to talk about savings. We're going to talk about getting financially fit. We're going to talk about having the chat, building a list of schools, and comparing financial aid offers. Now, I'm going to have a lot of content today, and I'm going to apologize up front. It's like we get one bite at the apple sometimes. We get one opportunity to be in front of some of you. So we want to get as much in as we can, but this is being recorded for any of you who are just joining us. This is being recorded so you can go back and listen to individual pieces of this. And we're always going to be available to answer questions going forward. So first, I'd like to start by talking about savings. So it might be obvious that everyone says, well, you should save, you should save, you should save. But really, when we focus on college affordability, why is savings so important? Well, it's for those reasons that I just mentioned. The vast majority of schools are not able to fill all needs. So there's often a gap after merit scholarships in need-based financial aid. Most families, as we said, are a little caught off guard by their EFC. So that they may not feel like they can actually come up with their full EFC, and having some savings can help with that. It's also meant to supplement summer earnings. We still run into parents sometimes who think, oh my goodness, I went to school and I could afford to work in the summer and get enough money, earn enough money to be able to cover tuition the next year. Well, you know what? I could too, back in 1987. Back in 1987, I went to the University of Maine. It was $750 a semester for tuition. Yes, I could earn that over the summer. But what we're looking at now just is not the same scenario. So summer earnings just don't go as far as they used to. They're important. They're a piecemeal piece. They're very, very important, but they just don't go as far as they used to. So most students need something to supplement that. So what we really want to communicate in this section, though, is why savings is not only important, but we want to reassure you that savings has very little impact on financial aid eligibility. In some cases, it's going to have no impact at all on financial aid eligibility. So we'd love to have people just say, okay, she said it, it must be true. But we know you've heard so many times that I don't want to just say, hey, you don't need to worry about that. I want to show you some information and some charts that I think will hopefully convince you that savings is a good thing and not going to have that negative impact that you may have heard from your neighbor down the street or in some other situation. So the EFC, the expected family contribution, again, comes out of the FAFSA formula. So we're focusing on the FAFSA formula at the moment, which, by the way, is available. It's publicly available. So we know exactly what does and doesn't impact that EFC. So the EFC is actually made up of 4 parts. The EFC is a combination of an expectation from income from parents, an expectation of contribution from assets, a contribution from student income, and a contribution from student assets. We today are just going to focus on the parent side of it. We're going to focus on contributions from income and contribution from assets on the parent side. By far, the biggest factor, the biggest driver of EFCs is parent income. So specifically the parent AGI, okay? So what you can see here is that I've taken a scenario where everything is the same about these families except for their AGI. In this scenario, all of these families are a family of 4. They have 1 student in college. And for the purposes of this first slide, they have no assets at all, okay? So the only variable here among these families is simply what their AGI is. So with family A, they have an AGI of 60,000. And when we put that information through the formula, what they come up with is an EFC, or an expected family contribution from income, of 3348. That's a stretch probably for a family making 60,000. But maybe it feels like it's possible, but it's probably a stretch. You take a family of $75,000 in AGI, and that EFC is going to be over $6,100. But then you look at the family that's earning $90,000, and their EFC is going to be over $10,000. Now, their income isn't that much more. You know, their income's $30,000 more than that $60,000 family, but look at how much higher their EFC is. And then you have the family that's earning 105, and look at the jump in their income. So their EFC is about 15,000. And what that's going to mean, if you have an EFC of 15, 16, 20,000, that means that even at our state public institutions, the student, aside from merit aid, is probably not going to get a lot of need-based aid beyond federal student loans and maybe some work study. They might get a small amount of grant funds, but it's going to be really minimal. I don't think that most people are prepared for that. I think most people earning, $100,000, $120,000 a year, they might think that they can contribute something, but they are not prepared for what the reality is when they don't have any savings and they realize that all they're really getting is some federal student loans, work study, maybe a small amount of grant funding. Okay. So we always go back and forth at FAME whether we should share this information early. We know this scares people. We know this is unsettling. But our thought is, after lots of discussion, is that we think it's better to share this information and for parents and students to have this information earlier so that you can plan accordingly. Being caught off guard and getting this information senior year is really devastating for some families. So the sooner people know, the more they can plan and have different options in place. So now what I want to do is we've kind of focused on the income side of things, but now I want to turn it around and focus on the asset side. So I've taken one of those scenarios, the family earning $75,000 per year. Again, everything is the same. But in this case, they have some assets. Now, one of the first things I want to talk about when we talk about assets is who has to provide asset information on the FAFSA. One of the things that's shocking to many people is that families who earn less than $50,000 a year typically do not need to provide any asset information on the FAFSA. So the FAFSA has something called skip logic built into it, and those families are often able to completely skip the asset questions. If you're able to skip them, we want you to, and that means that asset information has no impact on financial aid eligibility whatsoever. And a significant portion of our families in Maine earn less than $50,000 per year. But if you're one of those families who's earning more than $50,000 a year, you say, well, great, good for them, but what about me? One of the things we want you to know is that not all assets count on the FAFSA. So for a matter of fact, the most common assets that people have in many cases are excluded. So what is excluded from the FAFSA? When filling out the FAFSA, you do not need to list any information about your primary residence. So if you own a home, even if you have a ton of equity in it, that is completely excluded from the FAFSA. Additionally, Retirement plans are excluded from the FAFSA. So if you have a retirement plan that's sitting out there waiting for you to retire, you have assets sitting in a fund somewhere, that is completely excluded from the FAFSA so long as it is in an officially designated retirement account. One more big asset that's excluded, depending on your scenario, is small businesses. So if you are a small business owner, a family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, that is also excluded from the FAFSA. So those assets don't calculate in at all. So what are left for asset? What assets do count when filing the FAFSA? Cash counts, checking, regular savings. If you have a second property like a camp or a vacation home or something like that, or partial ownership of that, that would count. Or if you have non-retirement investments. So if you have investments like in the stock market or something, but they're not retirement related, then those indeed would count. So if you're someone who has those, then we can talk about what sort of impact is that going to have. So let's just assume for the sake of today's discussion that this is a family and they've got no assets, in some situations, but they have assets in other situations and the dollar amounts listed here. And let's just say it's money sitting in a savings account. Okay, let's keep it nice and simple. So for the first family, they're earning $75,000 a year. That's their adjusted gross income, and they have no savings. So back on that first screen, we show that their EFC would be about 6156. Scenario B, family earning exactly the same amount, but they've got $10,000 in cash sitting in the savings account. What does that look like for them? Well, their EFC does go up a little bit. Their EFC goes up by $240. So that is the amount that from that $10,000 is thought to be available to help pay for higher education. Family C has $25,000 sitting in a savings account, and their EFC does go up a bit as well. It goes up to $852 by that amount. So their EFC is going to be a little bit over $7,000. So it goes up a little bit, but still really minimal. And even family D, earning that $75,000, but having $50,000 in the bank, their EFC goes up by less than $2,000. But think of the options that that family has. Now, $50,000 is a lot of savings. Most families aren't going to be able to have that. But I wanted you to see that even with really significant savings, the impact on the EFC is really, really minimal. So we just want people to know that they can save with confidence, that it is not saving for higher ed that is resulting in people not getting the financial aid that they need. What we believe is happening in reality is that there are families who have saved. They're not getting as much aid as they thought they were going to, but it isn't because they saved. It's because they were never going to get as much money as they hoped that they were going to get. But by having savings, they have options available to them. Now with parents, the savings, the expectation of what from savings is going to be available or impact the EFC is a maximum of 5.64%. Okay, that's the maximum. And usually it's less than that. So the formula is a little bit complicated in that piece, but usually it's less than that. So we really want families to feel like they can save with confidence. There are a whole variety of ways to save for college. If there's everything from 529s, we'll talk just in a minute about those, to Coverdell accounts, to savings bonds, Roth IRAs, taxable savings and investment accounts, trust funds. But one of the things that we do want you to know is that you want to know how the savings impacts financial aid eligibility, meaning, does it count at all? So for example, if you choose to save in a Roth IRA, that asset is excluded from the FAFSA, because as we mentioned, retirement accounts are completely excluded. So a Roth IRA isn't going to show up on a FAFSA at all. If you decide to save in a 529 or a Coverdell, those are always going to be counted as a parent asset, regardless of who owns the account. It's always going to be a parent asset for a dependent student when parent information is required on the FAFSA. But then if a student is saving in a regular savings account, or if there's a trust fund, then that is going to be a student asset. And student assets do count more than parent assets. So student assets are assumed available at 20%. So if a student has $10,000 sitting in a savings account, the expectation is that $2,000 of that is going to be available to pay for higher education or to impact the EFC. Okay. Mary, I'm going to do one more little piece and then I'll stop briefly just to see if you have questions that I need to take immediately. And I'm not going to go into any great detail on this one today, but I did want to make sure that everyone is aware that in Maine, we have Nextgen. Nextgen 529 is Maine's designated 529 plan. And the reason that I want to mention this is that it's a really good way to save for higher education. People like 529s because you are able to put in after-tax money. That money hopefully grows over time. You get to decide. You have options as to how you invest those funds. And then you can use those funds to pay for higher education. If you use them to pay for qualified expenses, then you don't have to pay any tax on those earnings. So that's why people like 529s. They can be used in-state, out-of-state, even out of the country in some cases, public school, private school. They can be used to cover tuition, fees, also room and board as long as the student is enrolled half-time. So lots of flexibility with 529 plans. I wanted to mention Nextgen specifically because if you're a Maine resident or the student is a Maine resident, then we also have some amazing grants available. And so often when we're talking with families who are going to college and they're just starting to think about how they're going to pay for higher education, they're like, well, how come we didn't know about this earlier? Why has no one ever told me about this program and what's available? So I just wanted to be sure that you knew about this. You have to make a decision as to what's best for you. Every family's circumstances are different, but we do want you to know that there are grants available. And so we hope that you will check out this page and see what might work for you. And let me just say, as I go through this, I know that savings is hard. It's hard to save. This is not an easy thing to do, especially in the last couple of years when things have been so up in the air. But one of the things I want you to know is that saving even small amounts really can make a difference. And that has been the experience that Mary and I had. I did not have $50,000, $60,000 in college savings, but what savings we did have made such a tremendous difference. And that's especially true if you use that piecemeal approach. If you use that piecemeal approach, you don't need to save the whole huge amount that sometimes you'll hear about. Even small amounts can really make a significant difference. Mary, is there anything that's come up that you want to be sure that I address before?
Nothing in the chat, Mila. You're doing great. Thank you. I'm going to add the information about the Nextgen site and where to find that information, but no questions thus far.
Okay, but please ask people if you have questions. We'd love to have them. All right, so the next piece, I jumped ahead a little bit there, let me say it first, is to get financially fit. I don't know which is harder, to get financially fit or physically fit. Both can be real challenges, but both are incredibly important. So when we're talking about getting financially fit, it's really one of those scenarios where the earlier we can kind of get a hold of our finances and know what our finances are and start controlling our finances instead of having our finances control us, the better off we're going to be. This is particularly important when you're looking to, have money available to help pay for higher education. I have a sister, my niece is a junior in high school now. And so especially when she hit about middle school going into high school, I said, hard conversation for us to have even, but I said, really start thinking about the things that you can do before she ever gets to college that's going to make paying for higher education easier. And so some of these things are the things that we would love to have families think about. First of all, work towards paying off debt and reducing financial obligations. So one of the things that I thought about as my kids were approaching college ages, okay, where's my car at? When I'm always I always buy like a nicer used car, but I would strategically think about how long is my car going to last for? When will I not have a car payment? Can I take that money and do something else with it? So, for some people, it's credit card debt, doing everything you can to get your credit card debt paid down. You also want to think about reducing existing expenses. One of the things that I know I need to do, and this goes under the category of, small amounts seem like they don't matter sometimes, but it's those leaks those budgeting leaks that sometimes are where we lose a lot of money, is I need to go look at all of my darn subscriptions, right? So over the course of the pandemic, I have way more streaming subscriptions than I need, or other types of subscriptions. So, that's like one place I might start by saying, okay, I need to look at those and reduce some of those expenses. And you might have very different things that come to mind for you, but doing that budgeting review on a regular basis to make sure you know where your money's going and it's where you intend for it to be going these days. Also, resist the urge to take on new expenses. Sometimes families who think that savings is going to negatively impact their financial aid eligibility will say, well, what the heck? If we don't want to have savings because that's going to mess things up. So we're going to go make that big purchase that we've been thinking about. Hopefully, with the last couple of slides, you feel more comfortable that if you have savings, it's not going to have that negative impact. So you wouldn't have that same urge to do that. But I just want to really reinforce it, that savings is not going to have that sort of an impact on financial aid eligibility. And additionally, one thing that people are often caught off guard by is that the FAFSA doesn't take into account all the debt that you have. So that if you have debt or you have just spent a lot of money on a particular, possession, the FAFSA isn't going to recognize that. And so you have now limited your options. And there's no way that the financial aid is going to compensate for that. So just kind of keep those things in mind. The ultimate goal, whether it's to pay off a payment so that you don't have that, whether it is to reduce your expenses, all of those things, the goal is maybe having a side hustle. We were talking last night, we did a similar session. We were talking about one of our coworkers takes care of a dog, and that's a side hustle for her. And she makes pretty good money doing it. But looking at all sorts of ways to free up or increase the money in the budget. Because the idea is that before your student goes on to higher education, you want to be diverting as much money into college savings as possible. And then once that student is in school, to be able to take that money that you've been putting into the savings account and put it towards the tuition bill, put it towards a tuition payment plan, for example. So if you can do those things, again, you're not looking to pay the full balance. You just want to have money in the budget for a tuition payment plan or something like that as another one of those pieces in that piecemeal approach. Families that aren't prepared and don't know what to expect often don't have these options. When you don't know about any of this until senior year, you don't have the time to proactively make some of these adjustments to your budget. So that's why we're talking about this. Again, not easy. This is a hard conversation. These are hard things to do. But I would love to have you check out our FAME website. And Mary's going to put the link in there because we do have a whole section on financial wellness. And specifically, I want to mention a program called Enrich. It is a free online wellness tool. And so no cost to you, but it is just absolutely amazing, the resources that are available in Enrich. And one of my favorite things is that right from the get-go, you can do a money personality and kind of understand your money personality. And I think it's always interesting to see, even within one family, how different people have very different money personalities. And just understanding that about each other can be really beneficial. All right, next step 3, having the chat. So talking about money is hard. It's really, really hard. It's hard for couples. It's hard for parents and students. It's just another really, really hard thing to do. Some very interesting statistics here that Mary had pulled together. 69% of parents are reluctant to discuss finances with their kids. Nearly as many are uncomfortable talking to the children about sex as they are about money. Okay, so those things are almost equally taboo for many parents. A recent survey found, though, that 53% believe that if they had discussed paying for college with their parents earlier, they would have decreased the amount that was borrowed. So having this conversation, though not easy, is really, really important because ultimately what you want to be able to do is to be sure that you all are on the same page and have the same expectations. Mary's heard this story many times, so please forgive me, Mary. But when I started working at FAME, I used to work at UMaine, where Mary and I met, like I said, and I came to FAME in 2008. And my oldest son, Alex, at that point in time, I think he was in 8th grade. And so I traveled a lot in those first couple of years at FAME, going to do financial aid nights at high schools throughout the state. And he would come with me, and he'd ride in the car with me, and he'd do his homework. But he'd hear a lot of the financial aid stuff. So he learned a lot about how that whole process worked. And so we had conversations that I will tell you we probably never would have had it not been for my job, and had it not been that I was traveling so much and that he would go with me. But we started talking early on about what to expect. And, I never shared with him specifics like how much we made or any of that. But what I did do is I said to him, especially as we were approaching senior year in high school, is Alex, this is how much dad and I can afford. This is how much per year, approximately, we can afford to contribute towards your college education. And here are our expectations for you, that you're going to work, especially during the summer, that you're going to save the money that you're making. He was an easy to spend sort of kid. That you're going to apply for scholarships, that you need to do well academically. We had that conversation. So fast forward to February, March of senior year, and the financial aid offers are coming in. And he didn't get into his first choice school. And some of the others where he really wanted to go, he wanted to be in Boston, were schools that we just couldn't afford. I mean, they were like $30,000, you guys, after financial aid and all of that. And you know what? I'm not saying it wasn't difficult, but because he knew, we didn't even have to tell him that wasn't going to work, those particular schools, because we had already had the conversations. We'd laid the groundwork. He had a ballpark idea of what was affordable and what wasn't. And so, yeah, it was difficult. He went to a different school. It worked out fine. He then ended up transferring into the school he always wanted to go to, or at least the school he didn't get into the first year. And it all worked out. But I can't imagine trying to have that conversation if he and I hadn't had the years, literally years worth of conversations leading up to that. This time of year, we are regularly on the CAFE team, which is our college access and outreach team, having conversations with families where the students have one expectation and the parents have a totally different expectation. And it's just because they've never talked about it. So to help with these difficult conversations, on the back of that affordability piece that we shared earlier, are conversation starters. And these are the sorts of things that we think if families and students can have a conversation about these things, it is going to get people on the same page, and it's going to make everything a little bit easier. It doesn't solve all the problems, but talking about them can at least be enlightening as to where families are in agreement and where they might need to have a little bit more conversation about what the next steps are or what the real options are that are truly available to that student. Number 4 is building an affordable list of schools. So as we started talking about in the very beginning, schools are very different from one another in the sense that some schools are able to fill a lot of a student's financial need and others are not able to do that. So schools vary dramatically in the amounts of financial aid and the types of financial aid that they're able to offer. So as we, again, already talked about, but I wanted to reinforce here, that there are 2 broad categories of aid. There's merit-based aid. And again, that's the aid that's given to students based on who they are and the characteristics that they bring to the table. But one of the additional pieces I wanted to add here is that there are some schools that don't offer any merit aid. And this is one of the things that I learned because of Alex going through the process initially, because he had a friend whose family was not going to get any need-based aid. And so, in talking with them, it was really important that she find some schools that had really good merit aid. And the most selective schools out there, you think your Harvard, your Bates, Bowdoin, Colby, they do not tend to have merit aid. All of their students are meritorious. And so they are not trying to draw in those students using their merit aid. Instead, they dedicate all of their financial aid to being need-based financial aid. But those schools that are kind of like the next tier down, the still very selective and selective schools, are often a really good source of merit aid because they want those top-notch students that can go to those, most elite schools. But because those most elite schools don't offer merit aid, sometimes if they are able to, these next tier down schools are able to offer that merit aid, that will pull those students in. So you really want to be sure that if you're one of those families that has a higher EFC than you had anticipated, that you're sure you have, even if your student is capable of getting into these most selective schools, go ahead and apply. But be sure there are some of these other very selective and selective schools on their list if getting merit aid is a critical piece of paying for higher education. Again, need-based aid is always going to be something we want all students to apply for. We want every single student out there to file the FAFSA. And if you need help with that, we certainly can provide assistance. And then again, some schools require something called the CSS profile to award their own financial aid. In Maine, Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby are the only 3 schools that require the CSS profile. But when you start looking at schools in the Boston area, many of those schools require the profile. Okay, so you want to research them because you want to know what forms are required when you're applying for financial aid. As mentioned, schools do vary by cost, so therefore the need is going to vary. So as we talked about earlier, a low-cost school, not going to be quite as much need, but the same student, this is the same student looking at 3 different schools, the amount of need is going to vary dramatically. So, sometimes we hear people say something like, oh, I had an older child and they applied and they didn't get any financial aid, so I'm not going to bother applying for the younger child. Well, maybe that student was applying to a fairly low-cost school. And so at that low-cost school, they didn't get a lot of financial aid, or they just happened to apply to a school that didn't have good financial aid. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't apply for the other student, because if the other student is looking at different schools, and then circumstances change, it's really important to always apply for financial aid because you don't know for sure what your student is going to be eligible to receive. Now, when building the list of schools, one of the things that is super important is to, in advance, get a sense of what types of financial aid they have available. Meaning, do they offer good financial aid, or are they a school that's more challenged to provide financial aid to their students? So what we want people to research is something called the percent of need met. So if a school meets all of that student's need, they meet 100%. Let's say the student had $30,000 in need, and the school offered them $15,000 in financial aid. That means that school met 50% of their need. So that means that family is going to be challenged because they've got to come up with the other 15,000 plus their EFC. So percent of need met is a really important thing to have an understanding of long before you get the financial aid offer. It's a really important piece of information to have as your student is building the list of schools to apply to. The other thing that I just want people to keep in mind is that we really want to focus on the net price, not the sticker price. So the net price is the sticker price to start with, minus the grants and scholarships that a student is eligible to receive. So you really don't care that XYZ school costs $70,000. If they're going to give you a ton of aid, what you care about is what is the cost after those funds that don't have to be repaid. That's the net price. So we just want to be sure that people know that sometimes expensive schools have the best financial aid, and they're actually more affordable than lower price schools. So we want people to keep those options open as well. So when it comes to percent of need met, thankfully, there is a way that you can get to this. So I would love to have you check out and research schools using the College Board. So you're probably all familiar with the College Board, at least you will be by the time your kids are in high school. They're the SAT people, they're the AP people, but they also have a really, really great section called Big Future, which is all focused on finding colleges that are a good fit, doing the research on colleges, and figuring out how to pay for college. So the website is there, and I think Mary's going to put it in the chat as well. So when you do a college search on the Big Future site, first you have these 4 things that you're going to focus in on: location, major, type, campus life. So you can pick one of those or all 4 of those and make your selections. For the purposes of today's demo, we picked major. We said, okay, the only thing we selected is we want to major in environmental science. And so what the College Board does is they take their almost 4,000 schools and they filter it down to the schools that meet your criteria. So again, all we did is take all of the schools in their list and filter it down to, in this case, the 606 schools that have a major in environmental science. Once you get to this page, though, you will see that you have additional options available. And one of those options is affordability. So if you click on that, you can look further at these 606 schools, and you can filter out schools to get your list to be more manageable. And you can filter them out based on the percent of financial need met. So for example, you could say, I only want to look at the schools that meet 100% need. probably going to bring that list down pretty dramatically, or 90% need, or, even 75% need. So it's just a really good way of making sure that you have some schools, your student has some schools on their list that do a good job of meeting needs. Now, these are averages, okay? So every student is going to be different. We all know how averages work. They're extremes at both ends, but it's just one piece of information that can be really helpful when building a list of schools so that students have many options available to them. The other thing you can do is once you've got your list down to a more manageable number, you can go and use something called a net price calculator. So a net price calculator is a tool that lives on the individual school's website. So each school that has federal financial aid is required to have a net price calculator. And it's usually in their financial aid section, although I got to tell you, sometimes it's a really hard thing to find. So I find doing a search right on the school's homepage is sometimes the easiest way. Just type in net price calculator. What a net price calculator is the school uses their specific information, like how much do they have in grants and scholarships, and they allow you the opportunity to provide your specific information. So sometimes they'll just say, do you already know what your EFC is? Or sometimes they will gather enough information to estimate your EFC. And then based on that, they're going to show you what the financial aid offer would look like. Now, it's an estimate. It's never something you would make a final decision based on, but it can give you a really good idea of, okay, I think this would work. Or what happens sometimes is, oh gosh, I don't know that we could make this work. Doesn't mean you write that school off. I would never want you to do that. But instead, what it might mean is, okay, let's add another school or two to our list. So that if in reality, when we get the official financial aid offer, which might be different, we have some options available to us if it isn't going to come in the way that we'd like it to. This is all about having options available, which is why we want students to apply to multiple schools. I had a student the other day, 2 schools. That's all the student applied to. Very capable student. There are over, 3,800 or plus schools out there. And she only applied to 2 of them. There are other schools out there that would have offered her much better financial aid where I'm sure she could have met her needs. So we want to be sure, we don't want people going crazy and applying to 25, but to apply to a decent number so options exist. We also want to be sure that students don't get their heart set on a particular school, if possible, we know it's hard, before they ever get the financial aid offer. I'm working with a family right now where it is a battle. She is just intent on going to this school. They're looking at borrowing $50,000 a year. Can you imagine? But they're at loggerheads right now. And, it's just because she's got her heart set. She thinks that's the only thing that's ever going to work for her. It's a really, really trying situation. So whenever that's a possibility to avoid that, we want to do that. We also want to always have a financial aid safety school on the list. If the financial aid doesn't work out really well at all of the various schools, is there a school at the end of the day that still is going to be affordable and manageable? Now, I don't want decisions to be made solely on the financial aid. That is not at all what I'm saying. We need schools where students are going to be successful. The biggest key here is that students need to be able to graduate and earn that degree. That is the end goal. So we need them to go somewhere where they can do that. But it's just to totally ignore the financial aid and the financial, end result is just not realistic for most families. That's got to be a factor of consideration if we don't want students to leave school with more debt than is manageable for them. And then last but not least, and this is way down the road. So this is for seniors in high school and their parents, usually starting in January or so of their senior year. We want to be sure that they compare financial aid offers. Do you know that we have families out there who, when the student gets accepted, they will send in a deposit? They will do that sometimes without ever having seen a financial aid offer. And then what happens is fast forward to the summer and the first bill comes and they're not prepared for it, because they didn't really understand the cost, the true cost, before deciding where to attend. So to avoid that, what we would love to have students and their families do before they make any decision about the final decision, at least about where to attend, is to compare all of the financial aid offers from the schools that are still on their list. And to do that, you need to get an apples to apples comparison. Financial aid offers are going to vary dramatically in how they look from one school to the next. So it is not always as easy to do that comparison as we would like. So we developed this worksheet, which Mary will share as well. And this worksheet allows you to put in your costs. So we're going to focus on direct costs to start with: tuition, fees, room and board. So you can see that they would be able to, you'd fill these in here. We have a form that does the math for you. And so you'd be able to see what those direct costs were. Then you'd subtract out grants and scholarships. Again, those funds that don't need to be repaid. And that's going to give you your net cost. So that's what you really want to look at. Again, you don't want to focus on how much does a school cost to start with. What you really care about is how much does a school cost after grants and scholarships. And to be able to look at that, school A versus school B versus school C is really, really important. And then if you are going to need to borrow, we do recommend that if any borrowing is needed, to look at federal direct loans, and those will be included on the student's financial aid offer from the school. You'll probably see that offered on every financial aid offer or most financial aid offers, and it's going to be for the same dollar amount. Now, when comparing financial aid offers, the other things that are important is to keep in mind that you're talking about multiple years. So the family that this family that I was just mentioning, they could probably make this work for 1 year, the plan that the student wants to pursue, but it is not going to happen for 4 years. And so imagine a scenario where a student goes to their quote unquote dream school and absolutely loves it, and then finds sophomore year that they can't return. So that's why we really want people to think about multiple years, having a plan for multiple years, and in some cases, many cases, multiple children. I wish sometimes we didn't have to talk about the return on investment. I want students to be able to go to school and just study what they want to study and learn what they want to learn and pursue whatever career they want to pursue. But the reality is if they are going to need to borrow, they've got to think about those things in connection with one another. So if I've got a student who is going to go into a profession like social work, where they're probably going to need to have a master's degree, we know that they are not going to earn the type of money that someone coming out with an engineering degree is going to earn. They've got to take that into consideration. You know, what are they getting in terms of their degree, but what are their earnings going to look like? And can they afford to repay those loans after they graduate? This is not about just the 4 or 6 years that they're in school. This is really about what happens after they finish with school. You know, and are there going to be job openings? I mean, right now we're in a situation where there's a lot of job openings, so that doesn't seem as concerning today, but we always want to keep that in mind. And then, you know, how much money are they going to earn? What sort of benefits are they going to get? There's a great website. It's called Career One Stop. Mary's going to put the link in for that as well. That website is fabulous in the sense that you can look up earnings and you can look them up by state. You can look up nationally, you can look them up by state, and you can even look them up by zip code. So for matter of fact, I can go and look and see what the average nurse's salary is in Bangor versus Portland versus Presque Isle. So it's a really, really great way of getting a sense of what's that earnings potential going to look like, so that can be in sync with loans if loans are needed, and so that those two don't get out of whack. So coming to the end here, you know, I just want to end kind of where we started, which is with the piecemeal approach. Now that we've had a chance to talk about some of these other opportunities a little bit more, you can see how if you have 4, 5, 6 of these approaches available to you, you've got your financial aid, your merit aid, your student's going to apply for private scholarships, they've got some savings, you've got some savings, you've got some earnings, some money in your budget where you can do tuition payment plans, you know, tax credits. You then are in a situation where hopefully those bottom 2 categories are not needing to be maximized, but minimized instead. So, you know, we really think that if you can think of it from that approach, it is going to make all of this seem much more manageable. So at the end of the day, it's about just having as many options as possible. I know sometimes it's easy to think it's only this school, this is the only way I can get to where I want to go. But we know that in reality, there are multiple pathways available, multiple choices a student can make and achieve their goal. And we also want to keep in mind that, you know, the 4 years are just the 4 years. And that it's about after they graduate as well. So sometimes students live in these situations while they're in school where they're spending a lot of money on their housing, they're living in these fabulous places, they're doing all these great things. But what that means is when they graduate, then they have to move into a location that is maybe not what they dreamed about because they spent so much money and they borrowed more money than maybe they could have afforded while they were in school. So when students are in school, if they can live on the cheap, as we call it, they can make those financial sacrifices while they're in school. That is really, really going to pay off when they graduate, and they'll have much more financial freedom after the fact. We have a lot of resources available at FAME. We have tools and calculators, some of the tools we've shared today. And we have a great calculator where you can put in your salary and see how much a student loan debt is going to be reasonable, or vice versa. If a student is already projecting out how much they're going to borrow, they can see how much they would need to earn to repay that comfortably. So we love that tool. We have all sorts of information on filing the FAFSA. We have informational videos from start to finish in the process. And we also do financial aid information sessions. We are starting, if any of you are junior parents, we are starting our spring financial aid information sessions. The first one is actually next Thursday, March 10th, and we will be doing those in the coming months. So all of that information is available on our events page, and we'd love to have you check that out and join us for future sessions. As far as this particular series, Financial Check-ins with FAME, we do these on the first Friday of every month. We take a break in the summer, but in April, actually, Mary will be doing free digital financial wellness resources for students and families. And then in May, Martha Johnston will be doing managing student loan repayment. So we hope that you will check those out and join us for those if those are of interest to you. Again, I'm Mila Tappan. This is my email address. If you have any questions at all, I would love to have you reach out and talk more about them. Whew, Mary, we did it.
You sure did. Great job. That was wonderful. And you're not over at time. So
how about that? I mean, I know I can talk with them fast, but I always worry about losing people. But that's why I wanted you all to know this was recorded and you can revisit it later. Are there questions?
It's such valuable information and so important. Just a couple of quick questions. The first one is, did you say that 529 funds are included in assets, just like a checking or a savings account?
Yes. So 529 accounts do show up on the FAFSA. So again, for families who earn over $50,000 per year, they would need to list their 529. But one of the benefits of a 529 is it always counts as a parent asset. So if you go back to that scenario with that family, that was earning 75,000 and had $50,000, imagine that in a 529 plan, it only increased the EFC by 2,000. So yes, it does need to be listed, but the impact is really, really minimal. And the advantages of having those funds so far outweigh any small impact on the EFC.
Great, thank you, Mila. And then the other question, can we use IRA money for school without the 10% penalty? So addressing that, again, knowing we're not tax accountants, but then also from a FAFSA standpoint, what receiving an IRA distribution does in terms of untaxed income.
Yeah, so I am not a tax professional at all. So I would want someone to check with their tax person as far as whether or not their IRA is going to be taxable. From a financial aid perspective, when you take a distribution from an IRA, you are going to have to list that income, theoretically, it's income to you, on the FAFSA. Now, not to go into the weeds, but when we talk about filing a FAFSA, it's really important to know what years of information are required on the FAFSA. So for example, right now, we are doing FAFSAs. Let's think about our seniors in high school. They are completing the 22-23 FAFSA. They're completing the FAFSA for next fall and spring. That'll be their first year in college. The 22-23 FAFSA required 2020 income information. So the information required on the FAFSA is always 2 years prior. We call it prior in the financial aid world, which I know means nothing, but basically it's 2 years prior to that FAFSA year. So if someone was going to take a distribution from an IRA, from a financial aid perspective, one of the things I'd want them to think about is probably not taking it early in the first year or two when the student is in college, because that income is going to be probably required on either their junior or senior year FAFSA. But if they wait to take that distribution in junior or senior year, then they're not going to be filling out a FAFSA probably in the year where that came in as income. So I know that might not have been, this is unfortunately not super clear or super simple, but I'm happy to talk about those scenarios in more detail if people want to reach out to me by email or phone.
And that was all for questions, Mila. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. If you have thoughts regarding this session or other sessions, always feel free to reach out to us. We're really, really welcoming all sorts of feedback, good, bad, ideas, you name it. We'd love to hear it. So we hope to see you at a future session. So take care. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.